The disappearance of Bryce Laspisa. In August of 2013, Bryce Laspisa was a 19-year-old college student with his whole life ahead of him. He was intelligent, well-spoken, and described by those who knew him as polite and respectful. Bryce attended Sierra College in Northern California and lived off campus with his girlfriend. From the outside, his life appeared stable, but beneath the surface, something was changing. In the months leading up to his disappearance, Bryce's behavior became increasingly concerning. Friends noticed he had begun drinking heavily and using prescription medication. His girlfriend later admitted that their relationship was strained and that Bryce often seemed emotionally distant. Despite these warning signs, no one imagined that he was on the brink of vanishing without a trace. On August 28, 2013, Bryce packed up his car and began driving from his college apartment in Rocklin, California, to his parents' home in Laguna Niguel, more than 400 miles away. The drive should have taken roughly 7 hours. His parents expected him to arrive that evening, but he never did. Throughout the night, Bryce stayed in contact with his parents by phone. He told them he was tired and had pulled over to rest. What they didn't know at the time was that Bryce had parked his car at a rest stop in Buttonwillow, California, and he would remain there for nearly 13 hours. Surveillance footage later revealed Bryce sitting alone in his vehicle, getting out occasionally, stretching, and staring off into space. He appeared calm, not distressed, yet strangely motionless. He made phone calls, but he didn't sleep. He didn't continue driving. He simply stayed. Concerned, Bryce's parents contacted roadside assistance to check on him. When a service worker arrived, Bryce insisted he was fine and declined help. He reassured his parents again that he would be home soon. Hours passed. Finally, early in the morning of August 29, Bryce left the rest stop and resumed driving south. Less than an hour later, everything came to a sudden and chilling stop. Bryce's car was discovered crashed at the bottom of a ravine near Castaic Lake, just north of Los Angeles. The vehicle had gone off a cliff and flipped multiple times before landing upside down. At first glance, it looked like a fatal accident. But Bryce was gone. Inside the car, investigators found his phone, laptop, wallet, clothes, and personal belongings carefully placed. There was no blood at the scene, no signs of a struggle, and no indication that Bryce had suffered life-threatening injuries in the crash. It was as if he had simply stepped out of the wreck and disappeared into the surrounding wilderness. Search teams were dispatched immediately. The area around Castaic Lake was rugged and dangerous, filled with thick brush, steep terrain, and wildlife. Bloodhounds picked up Bryce's scent leading away from the car toward the lake. Then, suddenly, the scent stopped. Despite extensive searches by ground teams, divers, helicopters, and volunteers, no trace of Bryce Laspisa was ever found. No body surfaced in the lake. No clothing was recovered. No definitive evidence explained where he went or why. As days turned into weeks, theories began to emerge. One possibility is that Bryce took his own life. Some believe he intentionally drove off the cliff and walked into the lake afterward. However, investigators noted that the crash itself did not appear to be a suicide attempt, and Bryce had taken steps to preserve his belongings, something inconsistent with impulsive self-harm. Another theory suggests Bryce experienced a mental health crisis. His erratic behavior, long hours sitting in his car, and emotional withdrawal point toward a possible psychological break. In this scenario, Bryce may have wandered into the wilderness, disoriented and confused, eventually succumbing to the elements. Then there is the most unsettling theory of all, that Bryce staged his disappearance. Supporters of this idea point to the lack of physical evidence, the careful placement of his belongings, and the fact that no remains have ever been discovered. Some believe Bryce may have wanted to escape his life entirely and saw the crash as a way to disappear permanently. Yet this theory raises just as many questions. Bryce had no known plans, no large sums of money, and no confirmed sightings since that day. In more than a decade, not a single credible lead has surfaced. For Bryce's parents, the uncertainty is the hardest part. Without answers, they remain trapped between hope and grief, unable to fully mourn, yet unable to move on. Every unidentified body, every reported sighting, every new tip brings a mix of anticipation and dread. Years later, the case remains open. Bryce Laspisa is still missing. No confirmed sightings, no remains, no closure, only a quiet stretch of highway, a crashed car by a lake, and a young man who vanished into the unknown, leaving behind a mystery that refuses to fade. If you want, I can. The disappearance of Bryce Laspisa: theories, sightings, and unanswered questions. In the days following Bryce Laspisa's disappearance, investigators believed answers would come quickly. After all, his car had been found. His belongings were still there. The search area was defined. But as hours turned into days, then weeks, the case only grew darker and more confusing. Search teams focused heavily on Castaic Lake. Dogs had tracked Bryce's scent from the crash site down toward the water before it vanished entirely. Divers searched the lake repeatedly, convinced that Bryce may have entered the water. Yet despite multiple searches over the years, no body was ever recovered. For a lake that frequently returns victims within days or weeks, Bryce's absence raised serious doubts. As law enforcement struggled to find physical evidence, attention turned to Bryce's mental state in the days leading up to his disappearance. Records revealed that Bryce had been taking prescription medication while drinking heavily, an extremely dangerous combination. Friends later admitted that Bryce had given away personal belongings shortly before leaving college, a detail that deeply unsettled his parents. Some investigators believe Bryce may have been experiencing a mental health crisis, possibly psychosis or severe depression. His decision to sit in a rest stop for nearly 13 hours without sleeping, his calm but detached demeanor, and his refusal of help all point to a young man who was not thinking clearly. But if Bryce was disoriented, how did he survive the crash without serious injury and vanish without leaving a trace? Then came the sightings. Over the years, there have been dozens of alleged Bryce Laspisa sightings reported across the United States. Some claim to see a man matching his description in truck stops, homeless shelters, and small towns. One particularly disturbing report came from a truck driver who claimed he picked up a hitchhiker resembling Bryce months after his disappearance. None of these sightings were ever confirmed. Still, they fueled a growing belief that Bryce may have staged his disappearance intentionally. Supporters of this theory argue that Bryce's behavior that night was calculated. The placement of his belongings, the lack of blood, and the survivable nature of the crash suggest planning rather than panic. If Bryce wanted to disappear, crashing his car would be an effective way to convince authorities and his family that he was gone. But there's a problem with that theory. Bryce left behind everything: his money, his identification, his phone. Starting a new life without those essentials would be nearly impossible. And Bryce had no known connections, no history of running away, and no evidence of long-term planning. Another theory suggests Bryce didn't survive long after leaving the crash site, but not in the lake. The terrain around Castaic Lake is vast and unforgiving. Thick brush, steep hills, extreme heat, and dangerous wildlife make survival difficult, especially for someone injured or confused. Some believe Bryce wandered deeper into the wilderness, where his remains simply haven't been found. Yet after more than a decade, even that explanation feels incomplete. Cases similar to Bryce's often leave behind something: clothing, bones, personal items. In Bryce's case, there has been nothing. For his parents, the pain never eased. They've spoken openly about the guilt they carry, wondering if they should have driven to get him, forced him to stop, or recognized the warning signs sooner. They continue to advocate for awareness around mental health, hoping Bryce's story might save someone else. Every year that passes without answers deepens the mystery. Was Bryce Laspisa a young man in crisis who lost his life in the wilderness? Did he walk into the lake and disappear forever? Or did he successfully vanish, leaving behind only questions and heartbreak. To this day, no theory fully explains every detail. Bryce Laspisa remains one of the most haunting missing person cases in modern history, not because of what we know, but because of what we don't see. A quiet rest stop, a crashed car by a lake, and a life that ended or changed without explanation. Somewhere, the truth still exists waiting to be found.